Welcome to the channel whenweare.org. Everything we post and discuss is for entertainment purposes only. I think you know what that means. I believe we're living during Satan's little season. To be clear, I believe all preterism is off base and wrong. Preterism is defined as a Christian view interpreting most or all biblical end-time prophecies as being fulfilled in the past, primarily around the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And there are those that teach partial preterism and full preterism. But where those that teach preterism go wrong is not understanding that history itself is a lie. So their attempt to interpret the rest of the Bible is always going to be off because they see Armageddon as some small, localized, one or two cultural event happenings. So yes, the preterists are right that the end-time prophecies that most people think are future have actually already occurred. Armageddon has already occurred. Preterists look at the mainstream historical narrative and try to place Armageddon in that narrative, when actually there are satanic lies about our history fabricated and stretched over this hole in history where Armageddon and the 1,000-year reign of Christ took place. Our Creator has a good reason for everything that He does. We don't know His reasons for allowing Satan's little season. However, there must be good reason. We know that much. It must provide an answer in some way that Satan and any rebels, present or future, would raise. And the reason for God's patience is not for God to prove any point to Himself, but rather to establish a precedent once and for all. So if at any future time someone, human or angelic, questions God like Satan has, there will be no need for God to allow any rebellion for these types of questions to be explored or answered. He has allowed the original rebellion to go to a point whereby proving He is our Creator, not only has the right to rule us, He is right in His rule. The balance of His qualities, love, power, justice, wisdom, and mercy, are perfect. There is no flaw. So again, He not only has the right by virtue of being our Creator, He also has proven Himself to be right through every action He has ever taken. He didn't have to patiently allow time for these questions to be answered. However, He has demonstrated much patience, and it has proven His unquestionable righteousness. When Job was being tested, he didn't know about the conversation that took place in heaven prior to his test, because it was a test. In the end, Job proved faithful by not cursing God, although he wrongly believed that God was the one responsible for his problems. In the end, God corrected Job, but then proceeded to reverse the injustices that befell him. Now, I imagine there are some atheists and perhaps other fault finders who would say because God has the power to end pain and suffering, He should never have allowed Satan to test His servant Job in the first place. Perhaps they even condemn God as wicked for allowing it. To them I would say, time is running out. Satan's little season will come to an end. God will soon eliminate all injustice once and for all. But while there is time, while you're still alive and breathing, use your time wisely and explore the possibility that you are wrong. Look at the example we have in Christ, who allowed Himself to be tested, even tortured to death. He placed blame where it was due on Satan. Consider, too, the benefit that Christ's sacrifice and enduring His test offers you and me. The Bible states that the fear of Jehovah is the beginning of wisdom. Not the fear of the Christ, the fear of his Father, Jehovah. The fear you should have, obviously, too, is not fearing him like you would fear Satan, rather fearing him properly as a loving Father, who is also our Creator and the most benevolent being who's ever existed. Without the proper fear of God, you will always remain trapped in Satan's little fishbowl. You will never find your way out of his lies. Truth is knowable. You just have to keep groping for God in Satan's darkness. And if you keep searching for him, he will let himself be found by you. Most people, however, find a version of God or religion that they like, that is really false, and they become satisfied and stop searching, even believing they're saved while promoting religious lies. We have a general timeline that the Bible accurately describes and provides for us. The book of Daniel chapter 2 provides a prophecy using a statue of a man to represent human rulership and how it would be destroyed and replaced by God's kingdom. The head of gold was Babylon, the chest was Medo-Persia, the belly was Greece, the legs of iron represented Rome. After Rome, there was only one final body part representing one final world power. Before I realized true history has been hidden and fabricated, I believed, obviously, the Anglo-American world power represented the feet of the statue, and therefore it would be the last. Because I believed that, I believed Christ's return and the Great Tribulation and Armageddon was imminent. This is another reason why preterism is obviously off base. According to prophecy, Rome is represented by the legs of this statue, and yet there's still one final world power following it, represented by the feet of the statue. So obviously the end-time prophecies could not and would not have been fulfilled while Rome was a world power. Now my best guess is that Tartaria was the last world power. What I personally am sure of is that history is a lie. I researched the topic to a point that convinced me beyond a doubt. And I was thorough because I knew it would change my religious beliefs and my religion. My focus with this channel is going to be exposing the lies of history and geography, but especially religion. There are those that are doing a great job exposing the lies of geography and history, and I will provide links to all those that I would recommend. However, I have not come across anyone who's exposing religious lies accurately as it relates to Satan's little season. And it seems from my perspective that many people who discover the truth about geography and history are turned off by religion. Rightfully so. It can be problematic, false religion, that is. But then some turn away from God or believe that he is unknowable. However, the key to understanding all of these lies is only accurately found in the Bible. For most others who have false religious beliefs, who discover the lies of geography and history, many still hold on to their false religious beliefs, and therefore they'll never understand Satan's little season. And anyone who believes and teaches religious lies is in no doubt in danger of being adversely judged by God. You could be hiding the truth by promoting lies. You could be drawing people away from God, away from believing truth about God, and in effect, hiding God. Therefore, it's paramount that we understand religious lies so we can benefit and promote truth. And then, as I mentioned, the other pieces of the puzzle to Satan's little season will fall into place. Often it is true that Bible prophecy is only fully understood during or after fulfillment. Yes, the prophecies are there in writing, and yet they're only fully understood as the events unfold or after. And especially because we happen to be living during Satan's little season, a time which will go down in history, no doubt, as the most deceptive time to be alive. So if we're still in Satan's little season, and I believe we are, it shouldn't surprise us that there is some confusion. The Bible speaks of a future time when new scrolls will be opened, and I believe there will be eventually documentation from God explaining all the details. We'll know why, when, and who. When all the extra details are provided, I think we'll look back at what we have now, and we'll realize we really do have many, many details. We're not living during the pre-Armageddon judgment. However, we too, who were alive during Satan's little season, are also alive during a period of divine judgment. The Bible is key to understanding all of these truths. I don't think that we need to look into any apocryphal books. Jesus and his apostles didn't quote from any of the apocryphal books, and I don't think we need to either. I believe those books are possibly satanic and designed to look beneficial, even containing a few truths, and it seems like they would be benevolent and they're mysterious to draw ones into reading them. But I don't think God provided those books for us. As we explore the lies, understand this. The process is similar to if you suspect that your spouse has been unfaithful. Some people may react with utter disbelief and just go about their life. For others, they have to know. It's important to them to know the truth, so you become determined to look into it. Your spouse may be lying and trying to cover their tracks, so you can't just take their word for it. So you follow them one day and discover conclusively they are indeed unfaithful. How unfaithful have they been? To what extent and for how long? You may want to know, but you may never know the full extent. The point being in similarity is this. Satan is the ultimate unfaithful liar. When you discover that he has lied about history, you want to know the extent of it, the full truth of it. So keep seeking truth. However, realize we may never know the full extent of it. Now, the day will come, I believe, as I mentioned, when God will reveal it all to us. But for now, if you research history to the point that you realize there's been some crafty fabrication going on, remember, you don't have to have the answer for everything. Piece by piece, we can figure it out with God's help, in God's time. My experience, for example, was that religion is all important. However, when I realized history could be fabricated, I knew that my religious beliefs with regard to Bible prophecy could be affected, depending on what part of history had been fabricated. So researching history became my religion for a time. It was absolutely necessary for me to know, to research to the point where I could make a conclusive decision. And I have, and I did. I don't think we'll know the full scope or extent of the fabrication, of course, until God reveals it all. A human that is a good liar and is determined to conceal and cover their tracks can often be quite successful in their lying. Some perhaps are never caught. Here is another possibility in the scenario with the unfaithful spouse, which can make it challenging to know the truth. If another person or many other people whom you trust know the truth, but they lie for your spouse and they cover up. Now the lie or scheme becomes harder, if not impossible, to discern. The lie becomes easier to believe than the truth, because you may reason, all your friends wouldn't lie, would they? Although possible, you can certainly rationalize it is not very likely. What people have to realize is that the deception during Satan's little season, it is satanic. He is the source. Satan is a powerful spirit son of God. Yes, he turned evil. The point is, the level of deception that he is capable of is beyond anything we can imagine. Most people don't believe we're living during Satan's little season because they have underestimated Satan's power and his ability to deceive. The truth about the deceptive soup that we live in is this: there are some who know the truth, who are in effect blessed by Satan. They like the reward of sin or sins. They carry on the deception. Many others are oblivious, that are carrying on the lies. And when you interact with these ones, you can sense the real sincerity, genuine sincerity. And so these ones can cause you to doubt whether your investigating conspiracy theories is off base or a waste of time. However, remember, the truth may change your religious beliefs. It's worth investigating. The prophecy in Daniel 2 confirms after Rome there would be one final world power. Revelation 17 describes a seven-headed wild beast in prophetic terms, which also depicts human rulership. And it provides a detail which I think is important in understanding true chronology. Revelation 17:10, there are 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet arrived. But when he does arrive, he must remain a short while. So these heads of the beast represent world powers from the perspective of God's people. 5 had fallen, so from their perspective, that would have been Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. 1 is. That would have been Rome. That was the one that was in power when John wrote these words. The other has not yet arrived. I believe that was Tartaria. When he does arrive, he must remain a short while. So there's a clue. How long were these world powers ruling? Rome evidently was a power as a republic for 450 years, then as an empire for 503 years. So perhaps from the perspective of this world power and others, the last world power remaining a short while would be shorter in relation to these other world powers, and especially Rome. There are those that believe that the Statue of Liberty is really a statue of Lucifer. It's androgynous. It has a broken chain on its foot representing his being released after 1,000 years. So that puts the start of Satan's little season beginning around 1776. Now, what I know of my extensive research into history is that a lot of the lies in history that we can prove with pictures and documentation can be traced to the 1800s. So 1776, that seems plausible for the start date of Satan's little season. If we back up 1,000 years, that takes us to 776 CE. If Rome fell in 476 CE, and another world power, let's say Tartaria, took its place, Revelation said the last world power would remain a short while. From 476 to 776 would be 300 years. I think that qualifies, give or take a few years, as a short while when compared to how long other world powers have ruled. Now, another detail to add for those who are really trying to understand, and they're looking at history and events in history to a point where then it seemed to stop. The detail is that Jesus did say that he would begin ruling in the midst of his enemies. And that detail is confirmed in Revelation chapter 12, where it talks about Satan and the demons being cast out of heaven to the earth. And it says, "Woe for the earth and for the sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great anger, knowing he has a short period of time." So, but it continues in that chapter. It says that now have come to pass the authority of the Christ. And so it seems that, again, Christ began ruling, and then the first thing he did was cast out Satan and the demons from the heaven, confining them to the earth. And so events intensified there. But that would extend this 776 date for an unknown period of time, a short period of time. That's just something to factor in. John's vision of Revelation was when he came to be in the Lord's day. He describes the world power at that time, that would be the last world power, as having two horns like a lamb. In Daniel, when the Medo-Persian dual world government was described, it was depicted as having two horns, because the last world power, described by John, had two horns. I believe that's an indication that the last world power was a dual world power. So perhaps it was Tartaria and another power, or does Tartaria encompass two entities? I don't know. In any case, we know God's word is true and doesn't just provide details without meaning. So most likely one or the other. At the Last Supper, at Luke chapter 22, Jesus began to gather those who would have a heavenly hope for the purpose of being kings and priests with him in heaven for the 1,000 years. He made a covenant with them for a kingdom. What would they begin to rule over? The earth, obviously. He foretold a time after his going away, during which time Satan would corrupt, or true Christianity would corrupt what he started. Matthew chapter 13, Jesus provided an illustration of true Christian wheat as a field, and it was oversown by weeds. And a servant in this illustration observes this corrupting, the oversowing of the field, and asks the master if he would want this slave to take immediate steps to intervene. And the master says no. Let them grow together until the harvest. Then it will be more discernible who the true wheat and weeds are. Then at the harvest, the master will send out workers to collect and burn the weeds and preserve the wheat. So this is another reason or example why preterism is off base in saying the end time took place with the destruction of the Jewish temple. That would have been almost immediately after Jesus left. It wouldn't have been a prolonged period of time where true Christianity would be corrupted. Another reason, of course, why preterism is wrong, as we explained, Rome was not the final world power mentioned in either of those illustrations. There would be another final world power. In Daniel chapter 7, the world powers are described in a similar way, using wild beasts with various attributes. However, in the illustration in Daniel, there are 4 separate beasts that represent the final world powers. Babylon the first, Medo-Persia the second, Greece the third, Rome the fourth. But the last beast grows a horn and is described as astute and arrogant and unlike any of the other beasts. And in the end of the illustration, it's the final beast, the last one just before God's kingdom rules. Therefore, I believe this detail indicates in some way Rome morphs into the last beast. Or in other words, the last world power springs from Rome. I don't know how else this could be interpreted because of this detailed explanation. And I believe, again, the Bible is true, and there's continuity between the different books. So instead of seeing Revelation is right and Daniel is wrong, or vice versa, I believe both are correct, and together they provide accurate details. Therefore, this detail helps to understand the time frame as well, of how all the ornate buildings that we see literally throughout the world, with such similarity and continuity and quality of building material, how they were built in the time frame. The Bible identified Satan as the ruler of the world, and I believe Satan was proud and eager to demonstrate what he knew, and what he knew would be his last opportunity to rule the whole world. It was his last hurrah, so to speak. So he for sure was giving direction to human workers. But I suspect even more than that. I believe he was helping with his power and knowledge of true science, locating materials, moving materials, and maybe even actually building. So to be clear, I believe Satan for sure was directing, overseeing the building of the nations. But I also don't know for sure, but suspect Satan was also contributing, actually using his supernatural power. So let's put a footnote here. I'm trying to put things in a logical order, and it's difficult. There's no perfect way to explain the nonsense that we live under in Satan's little season. However, because I said that after Rome was the final world power, after that, and it was Satan's last hurrah or opportunity to rule the world, many, rightfully so, are wondering, what about the current world powers? USA and all the other nations, Russia, China, Iran, Britain. Well, if we're living during Satan's little season, then God's kingdom has begun ruling on earth over some very blessed individuals, and it is still ruling. There will never be an end to its rule. Since the Bible has to be true, it would mean that the organically grown nations of the past, the world powers that represented the beast from the flood of Noah's day, on that succession of world powers, it came to an end. The Bible says that that beast would be hurled into the lake of fire, never to return. Satan is again misleading a part of mankind that he has authority over here in Satan's little fishbowl during Satan's little season. So when the Bible says that Satan would be let loose from his abyss after 1,000 years and mislead the nations in the 4 corners of the earth, obviously we can conclude that part of this misleading includes lying about history to make us think Armageddon didn't happen yet, and lying about geography, that is the shape of the earth, and how the continents are actually laid out to actually hide God's kingdom, which is actually ruling right now on this earth. And of course, lies of religion, because he doesn't want anyone to be faithful to God. He wants to be your God, and he succeeds when you don't believe the truth. So to answer that question, what about the nations today? What we have are actors on a stage. Yes, I know there are large ships and armies and planes and people going to battle with real guns, and people die. I know that. However, if it really is the most elaborate stage the world has ever seen, how could you prove that it isn't? You can't, because it is. If something is actually true, it can't be proven false. True, it can be obscured. However, actual truth can't be proven false. Okay, so end of footnote. Back to considering the time period right before Armageddon and the last true world power, which we think is Tartaria. 1 Thessalonians 5:3 adds another detail that Satan's rulership over the last world power would end at a time, at Armageddon, when the nations would make a significant proclamation of having peace and security. Now, I've often tried to imagine what it must have been like to be a human alive at that time, living in one of those cities with such amazing architecture and free energy, with convenient transportation. And if humans can be healed through frequency and, of course, using other natural herbs and resources, why wouldn't Satan use that to influence humankind into serving him? Satan obviously can't grant us everlasting life. However, with his knowledge, his true understanding of how we heal, he could use that to his advantage and maybe even help humans heal quickly and live a lot longer than they live now. If Satan helped humans at that time in that way as well, I can see how humans could have been fooled into thinking, we don't need God's kingdom. We now have true peace and security. Most people who are posting and providing content about Satan's little season, I believe, are insinuating that all the buildings that we see were built during the 1,000-year reign of Christ under his rulership, because the buildings are grand, they're beautiful, and they seem to be obviously built and designed with superhuman intelligence and knowledge. However, the Bible is key to understanding the truth that that is not the case. They were not built during the 1,000-year reign of Christ, but just before. The evidence of the mud flood and the melting of some of the buildings, I believe, is evidence of Armageddon and God's adverse judgment on that system of things. Psalm 127:1 says this, "Unless Jehovah builds the house, it is in vain that its builders work hard on it. Unless Jehovah guards the city, it is in vain that the guard stays awake." So if God's King, Christ, is responsible for all those buildings, why were they allowed to be destroyed? Did God's kingdom build them, and then God's kingdom destroyed them? No, there would be no end to his kingdom. Another truth that adds to the details that help us understand this is Isaiah 65. The context of this prophecy is obviously pointing from this time period to the future time when God's kingdom would rule. Notice what it makes clear. Isaiah 65:21 and 22. "They will build houses and live in them. They will plant vineyards and eat their fruitage. They will not build for someone else to inhabit, nor will they plant for others to eat." If you believe that the amazing architecture that we see in these older buildings was done by Christ or those he was ruling over, then they did build, and someone else is now living in them, not only living in them, but destroying most of them. That doesn't fit with the details that God left us in His Word. Therefore, the construction had to have been done by the nations Satan was ruling over just prior to Armageddon. Now that we've established a lot of the details, I think I can provide an overview which will make a little more sense or be a little easier to follow. I believe the mainstream historical narrative is fabricated on purpose. I believe we can trust the history in the Bible, which takes us to Rome and then one final world power after Rome, which existed for a short while. As explained earlier, Rome morphed or transitioned into the last world power. Another way to put it is that the last world power sprung from Rome. All the amazing architecture that we see was probably created during the last 100 years of Roman rule and then flourished during the last 300 years of Tartarian rule. Although Tartaria, we assume, was the last world power, there is another political beast described in Revelation that was made in the image of the first wild beast that seems to be made up of all of the nations in the world at that time, kind of like the United Nations today. Revelation indicates that all the nations at that time would give their power over to that wild beast for a short while. As I also explained earlier, the last world power, Tartaria, we believe, in Revelation, the last world power was described as a two-horned wild beast. So you had two nations, perhaps Tartaria and another nation, acting as a dual world power. Then all the rest of the nations were evidently united, much like the United Nations, which was described in Revelation as a beast made in the image of the first wild beast. That would be just shortly before Armageddon. I believe that is why we see continuity in the architecture throughout the world, all of the buildings in the world. I believe it's because these buildings were basically Tartarian outposts or governmental buildings connected with the United Nations of that time. So when that system of things under Satan's rule was at its peak, then a significant cry of peace and security was made. And if you remember the wording of that prophecy, it states that instant destruction, like the birth pains of a pregnant woman, would be upon them. So perhaps the cry of peace and security triggered other events which culminated in the Great Tribulation. If you think things are bad now, evidently they were worse during the time period just before Armageddon, which was called a Great Tribulation. Matthew 24, 21 and 22, Jesus said, "For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the world's beginning until now, no, nor will occur again. In fact, unless those days were cut short, no flesh would be saved. But on account of the chosen ones, those days will be cut short." So the days were cut short, and flesh was saved out of the Great Tribulation. Next came Armageddon, which was a selective destruction of the nations by God. And to be clear, obviously the flesh that was saved out of the Great Tribulation were saved because they were righteous, and they had washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. They're also identified as a great crowd. These would be protected by God and not destroyed at Armageddon. Revelation 6 describes Armageddon in this way. Revelation 6, starting in verse 15, "Then the kings of the earth, the high officials, the military commanders, the rich, the strong, every slave and every free person, hid in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they keep saying to the mountains and to the rocks, 'Fall over us and hide us from the face of the one seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, because The great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? Revelation 19 describes Revelation and adds a few more details. Verse 19, and I saw the wild beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to war against the one seated on the horse and against his army. And the wild beast was caught, and along with it the false prophet that performed in front of it the signs with which he misled those who received the mark of the wild beast and those who worship its image. While still alive, they both were hurled into the fiery lake that burns with sulfur. But the rest were killed off with the long sword that proceeded out of the mouth of the one seated on the horse, and all the birds were filled with their flesh. It's stated at 2 Thessalonians 1:9 that those who died during this time period of divine judgment, that they would undergo the judicial punishment of everlasting destruction. So again, it was a time period of divine judgment. They would not receive a resurrection from that judgment. The next episode will continue to explore many of the religious lies that hide God, dishonor God, and perpetuate false hopes to people in the name of Christianity. Let's end on a positive note. If you're just now learning about Satan's little season, I feel for you. It can be absolutely overwhelming. It can be lonely. And when you realize that what you've believed your whole life is a lie, it's confusing. Perhaps even friends and family marginalize you, even avoiding you, thinking that you're insane. Perhaps by episode 3 and 4 or 5, I'll give my story for those who are curious. If you have followed along with what we've covered thus far, it may not have sunk in yet. However, an important question is now answerable. That is, which religion is the true religion? The obvious answer, none of them, here in Satan's little fishbowl. Now true, some are teaching more accurately than others. However, the true Christian church or congregation that the Bible spoke of is no longer here. It's there. I'm pointing towards the north because that's where I think the earthly subjects of God's kingdom are. The kingdom Ezekiel spoke of, the city with the most beautiful name a city could ever be called. It's in the last verse of the last book of Ezekiel. It's called Jehovah is there. Can you imagine what that city must be like? Where God is actually there. If God's kingdom is actually reigning on earth, and you are making religious claims that God is directing you, or God has spoken to you, or through you, and you are providing religious direction to people, beware. You could be in a category that is not a favorable category to be in, similar to being a false prophet. Now, if truth is unknowable, then one could turn to God and rightfully ask, how was I supposed to know? I didn't know. If in fact the truth is absolutely knowable, but we preferred to believe and promote religious lies, in that case, we would not be in a favorable position before God. One could even be sincere. Remember Jesus' words at Matthew 7:22? The context of that verse was pre-Armageddon. And ones were saying, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and expel demons in your name and perform many powerful works in your name? And Jesus said, then I would confess to them, I never knew you. Get away from me, you workers of lawlessness. So again, sincerity alone is not enough. So I have to end the episode somewhere. This is probably a good place. What was the positive note to end on? The truth is knowable. Keep searching for truth. Truth about geography, truth about our history, and most importantly, truth about religion. It's all in the Bible, the books that Jesus and his apostles quoted from, not the apocryphal books. I believe they're a distraction. Read the book of Ezekiel, which describes how disgusted God was with earthly Jerusalem when they strayed from pure worship, with their adopting pagan customs, idolatry, immorality. Then by contrast, towards the end of the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel sees the future kingdom, from his time that is, the kingdom ruled by God. How resplendent and beautiful and glorious. If we're living during Satan's little season, according to the Bible, it means that kingdom is now currently ruling. There is no end to that glorious kingdom. Realizing that truth is mind-blowing and invigorating. But then you realize, wait, what? Why am I here and not there? If that's the city where God is, that's where I want to be. Me too. And I believe it's possible. In the next episode, we'll cover, or start to cover, when I believe we can get there and how to survive Satan's little season.